Lucy Prebble doesn't write a new play that often, but when she does, it's always an event. After her professional debut with The Sugar Syndrome in 2003, she's actually only written three more plays: Enron in 2009, The Effect in 2012, and A Very Expensive Poison last year, 2019. They've all been extraordinary successes, though. They've all won major prizes. Enron transferred from Chichester to the Royal Court to the West End and then to Broadway. The Effect opened at the National, has been widely revived, and was listed by The Independent as one of the 40 greatest plays of all time. A Very Expensive Poison was a huge success last year in a substantial run at the enormous Old Vic Theatre in London. Elsewhere, she's an in-demand television writer with credits that include Secret Diary of a Call Girl, the forthcoming I Hate Susie, and of course, the shatteringly brilliant HBO drama Succession. She is, unusually for a playwright these days, a public figure in a way. A short piece she wrote for the London Review of Books in November 2017 was, I'd say, a key catalyst for the expansion of the Me Too movement into British theatre. Alone, I think, of the playwrights that I've interviewed for this series, she has written the script for a major shoot-'em-up video game, and B, appeared on Have I Got News for You? There's a wonderful podcast, which I thoroughly recommend for anyone who's interested in playwriting. It's about comedy. It's called Rule of Three. But every episode is fantastic about writing of any kind, really. And she's a guest on an episode talking about When Harry Met Sally, and it's a fantastic episode. You will learn so much about comedy, about playwriting, about all sorts of things. Although, as I say, there are relatively few plays, and those plays are actually pretty wildly different from each other, there are connections, things that make Lucy Prebble's style and preoccupations recognizable. And actually the style and the preoccupations go together, because I think crucially she's interested in the world and she's interested in the theatre. I mean, all playwrights are interested in the world and the theatre, but what she does is connect an almost journalistic sense of contemporary public issues with a deep intuition about what theatre can say about those issues that journalism or television can't. In a way, she does this, I think, by seeing the theatrical in our contemporary moment. That's most obvious, I think, in something like Enron, which is a massive play about the enormous, $100 billion US energy giant that collapsed in 2001 amid revelations about their fraudulent accounting processes and corporate fraud and so on. Documentary makers, journalists could unpick the details of that story. But Prebble's play saw that the fraud was, in essence, theatrical trickery. Enron, the company, created dazzling fictions. It found untold riches in its audience's imaginations. It told a good story. And Enron on stage told that story of the company in a kind of dazzling vaudeville of magic tricks and dance routines, ventriloquists and velociraptors, barbershop quartets, and the Three Blind Mice. Each giddy new device genuinely illuminating not just the mechanics of accountancy fraud, but the theatrical sleight of hand that made it possible. In A Very Expensive Poison, she is, I suppose, on somewhat similar ground, though this time she's telling the story of Alexander Litvinenko, an officer in the Russian Secret Service who turned whistleblower. and moved to London, where he was murdered, famously poisoned with polonium-210 in November 2006. And the story was scandalous enough in itself. And of course, with our present anxieties about Russian interference in Western political affairs, and then a couple of years ago, the Skripal poisoning in Salisbury, this 13-year-old story was of contemporary concern, showing, of course, how little Russia had changed. Prebble's play drew on the full resources of the old Vic, telling the story by bringing to life the spitting image style caricatures of the Russian program Kukli, weaving together songs, shadow puppetry, direct address, stand-up comedy, and more to tell this story of how Putin can act with such dazzling impunity. These two are her most public plays, or most obviously public plays. The same questioning theatricality animates the more personal plays as well. The Effect is a really, really, really beautiful piece set in the perhaps unpromising environment of a drug trial, a clinic where they hold drug trials. A man and a woman, Connie and Tristan, are in this clinic. They're taking doses of an experimental drug. They flirt, they hit it off, and soon they're falling in love. But is this the real thing or just a side effect of the drug? And then, of course, have they even been taking the drug, or is it just the placebo? Are their own feelings a kind of placebo? The doctors, of course, can't tell them. It's a drug trial. The play asks questions about how far we can trust our own feelings, but also the extent to which the human mind and the human heart must always escape the narrowly pharmacological or neurological view of the brain. But it's also a theatre play, and it's a kind of play about theatre because as we are beguiled and touched and heartbroken by Connie and Tristan's story, played beautifully in the original production by Billy Piper and John Joe O'Neill, we're aware that this too is a kind of illusion, but of that distinctively, puzzlingly theatrical kind. It feels real. So why can't this fiction be real? At work in the plays too, I would say, is a wicked and daring humour, which you'll see in this interview as well, I'm sure, alongside a deep vein of compassion. In The Sugar Syndrome, a relatively early play about internet communication, a girl starts talking to a paedophile online. But what could have been a predictable play, I suppose, about grooming and predation goes somewhere much more surprising and testing and savagely funny. Right from the beginning, Lucy has shown herself to be a thrillingly confident writer who links politics and theatre, the public and the private, like no one else. So here's Lucy Prebble. I can hear you very well. How are you? Your camera seems to be very high up.
It is very high up. I basically have I have a computer that's very high. I often use it as a standing desk. I was considering standing this, but I'm not sure. I'm a bit tired of standing. Is it problematic?
No, not at all. No, it looks vaguely like CCTV looking at someone in prison.
It does look like that, doesn't it? It's not helped by the fact that I have nothing really behind me very much at the moment. Things on this wall, so it looks faintly like I've been taken hostage.
Exactly. How is lockdown for you?
I don't love it. I find it. Not great. I find it's exposing of a lot of my strategies as to how I order my life. You know, it becomes clear to me the way in which I sort of use going out and seeing other people as a very important reward system, and context for writing, and without that carrot, it's quite difficult to make sense of the stick, as it were.
Yes. So does that mean you're finding you are not very productive, or you are differently productive, or it's totally thrown your work rhythm?
Well, I am productive, but that's because I'm actually doing a job every day. So I'm in post production on a television program. So I basically have, written and show run something that we managed to shoot all of, by the end of January. So I've been editing, and you're doing a lot of rewriting and ADR and the grade and the sound mix. So it's actually a very extensive post-production process that's happening every day, normal working hours that I do here on my computer. So it's probably a good stage to be at home for, I suppose, because it's all on screen.
Is this I Hate Susie? Okay, so that hasn't been affected then by the pandemic.
Well, it has been affected in the sense that our whole post-production schedule has been messed up by it. But I feel really sorry for people who didn't get their filming finished before this happened, because that's right. Really the worst situation. So stuff like, for example, it surprises me how much television relies on ADR, adding dialogue after the fact, and so that's really difficult, because that has to be done under really, really sort of particular circumstances, where you go into a studio and the actors, they redo the lines and then you layer them very carefully over the mouth. But that's not possible here. Nobody's able to do that. So there are ways in which it's really difficult to get that. So if you've got a scene you can't really hear what somebody's saying, they can't just record it on their computer and send it in. It won't sit right. It has to be done in a very particular way. So stuff like that is really hard. You're sort of going, what can I do as a writer to solve that problem? Can I cut the line? Can I use a line from somewhere else and put it in? I have to solve a puzzle. How are you? Are we starting? Is this an interview, or are we?
I sort of had started, because it seemed natural. I don't want to trick you. I am actually already recording.
I just want to make sure I don't say anything libelous or anything.
I'm fine, thank you. When should we expect to be able to see I Hate Susie?
Well, that's the thing. There's no transmission date at the moment, because nobody knows exactly what's going to happen in the next few weeks. So we're hoping to finish post-production in the next few weeks. And then after that, either it'll just come on immediately, or I suspect that all the channels will be very carefully judging when to put what on the basis of what's happening with the pandemic. So I've heard a lot of rumours from lots of different writers and lots of different channels that people are very, very wary of certain dates, because they have a belief that that's when things will be being lifted. And everyone who has been sitting at home watching stuff will go, that's the last thing I want to do. I want to be outside. I want to, be as far away from television as possible. So there's a little bit of a unknown gambling game going on at the moment, where everyone's sort of waiting to see.
I know you probably can't talk too much about a show that hasn't been aired yet, but kind of sort of roughly, where did it come from? How did it start?
Well, it started very much from conversations between myself and Billy Piper, who stars in it, and we're very old friends, and we basically have had a lot of conversations over the years about if we could do a television show together that we actually really wanted to do, if we could do anything, what would it be? And half on thinking that would just never happen, and then eventually Billy was the one really that said to me, let's write something, let's come up with something, and you write it, and we'll try and sell it. And because she's really front foot like that, she's very brave, and kind of she's quite, I'm far more sort of cautious and pessimistic by nature. So I would always be like, yeah, no one will let us do that. So anyway, so I went away and I started writing something, and eventually it came to be what is now I Hate Susie, which is basically, I was thinking, how can we write about what we were sort of really interested in, which was women in their 30s, which we both are, but also sort of the politics of what's going on at the time, women in entertainment, personal sort of nervous breakdowns that people we knew were having and the form that they took. And we just sort of, I was always really fascinated by what had happened to those women who, if you remember that massive hack that there was of people's iPhones, of their storage, their storage facility with all the photos on. And I remember that was so huge and shocking at the time. And I just never really heard much after it about what effect that had on them and their lives and their psyche and their careers and stuff. And so I started to look into it, and then and I sort of came up with the idea that this character that we've been working on, that Billy would play, Susie, sort of is an actress to whom this happens, and the surprising ways it would affect her life to have these photos out there. So it's sort of a show about being revealed as a person at the same time as having a sort of terrible trauma inflicted on you as a woman. And so the show is like 8 episodes in different stages of how it affects her in her life, basically.
Okay. Obviously you have a kind of very distinct kind of balance, I guess, between doing theatre and TV. Do your stage plays start in a different way from TV projects and ideas?
Yeah, I suppose they do. I hadn't thought of it like that. I don't know why, but television ideas will often come to me from a sort of external source more. I was thinking about this the other day because under lockdown, producers they're not able to make things. You know, there's not a lot of stuff in production. So I found that I'm getting a lot of emails from producers at the moment in actually a slightly oppressive, overwhelming way. And I'm not saying that in like oh, isn't it great? I'm getting offered loads of work. They're not always taking the form of job offers. They're quite often emails sort of going, do you want to have a general meeting over Zoom? You know, there's quite a lot of like, do you want to pitch for this great piece of IP that we've got? But way more than normal. And I'm actually finding it, to be honest, a little bit oppressive, because it feels to me like there's this whole industry that's looking around and going, shit, all we can do is develop right now. So we're just going to turn that dial up to 11 and get writers working for us, you know, in this sort of, in this kind of like factory of working, so that then when we can get back to shooting, we can just get back to doing it really as soon as we can. And there's part of me that's like, hold on a minute, maybe not. Maybe take a beat to not carry on. Like you've gone off the edge of a cliff and the cartoon character's legs are still like running and running and running. I can feel this whole industry kind of doing that. And I'm not sure that's the psychological place that I'm in, to just sort of be using this time on a sort of hamster wheel of trying to keep the industry going. So anyway, why I bring that up is because it reminded me of how incredibly reactive I am in television. Like it always feels to me like it's about somebody saying, you know, what about this? What about that? Or you know, what do channels want? What do people want? Whereas the thing about theatre that I think makes it really valuable, and why maybe some of my favourite work that I've done has been that it's always come from me first. It's always been me going, I'm slightly obsessed with this idea of this, which sounds ridiculous and crazy, but I wonder if maybe it would be a play, maybe I could talk to someone about it. And I think the art that you make that's active rather than reactive in its conception is probably better.
And is there a sort of typical form in which a stage play would start? And what I mean by that is it that you go, there's a thing happening in culture that I'm obsessed with, or is it that you go, I've just got this idea of a character, or there's an image, or there's an event, or something? Is there a typical way they start in that sense?
Well, I haven't written that many plays, so there isn't like there isn't like this huge well to draw from. I think they're all slightly different. I don't know. I'm often first of all inspired by having a very strong sense of knowing how to tell the story theatrically. So, for example, in a very, very simple way, with something like Enron, second play that I wrote that was about the sort of corporate finance sector to some extent, was I knew immediately that what I was passionate about doing was a sort of tragedy musical about corporate finance, because I knew that there was something in the fact that all that business has operated along those lines for so long. You know, the idea of, if you throw the biggest party, the Cirque du Soleil party, you know, in one of the big banks, institutions, the idea of if you're shiny enough and jazz hands enough, people will invest in you. If you do it with enough panache and confidence, you know, it doesn't matter. And that had been going on for decades and decades, well, particularly since the 90s, really the mid-80s, I suppose, with the relaxation of regulation and stuff. And I was aware of that, and I was aware that that was not a way that it was ever really portrayed, that it was always portrayed as grey men in grey rooms, or in a kind of aspirational, clean, like capitalist celebration way, like the sort of Michael J. Fox movie Secret of My Success of the 80s, you know, the sort of like the guy who works in the mailroom gets to be the CEO.
Yeah.
Anyway, so it's normally like one issue of form, I suppose. And then with the effect, I wrote a play that was set during a clinical trial, and I was just very quickly, I was like, hang on, I really want to do a play set during a clinical trial, because and that was after I'd read about the terrible events that happened in 2006 at Northwick Park,
yes,
where people were really, really badly injured and someone died during a drug trial. But I thought this would be a very specific environment for theatre, because you're literally going into a space for a certain amount of time, you can't leave, and you're observing the behaviour of people. So it's kind of perfect for that. So I'm only really interested in doing plays which I feel immediately I have a very, very strong sense of why the form is theatrical and that it hasn't been done before, and that I would really like to make it work, basically.
That's great. I have to get an iced lolly out of the freezer for my son. Give me 1 minute. I'm really sorry about this.
Fine, I'll get hammered. He's got a lot of books, hasn't he?
It's done. Okay. I think I may spit that out.
Oh no, you mustn't. It's real life.
That's really interesting. So in a way, because quite a few of your plays, sort of, they are absolutely kind of immersed in a kind of real world thing that's happening, whether it's like, you know, it's in the internet, or it's Enron, or that's the Litvinenko poisoning or something. But it's finding a kind of, it almost feels like it's finding the theatre in those real events that allows you to kind of think of how they become theatre.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it's yeah, it happens on two levels, I suppose. For some reason, there's something very emotional that resonates in me about the story, whatever it is.
Right.
And I think with A Very Expensive Poison, I knew immediately there was something about a woman who'd lost her husband. There was something about the grief of that and the love of that I knew I wanted to write about that time in my life. And then once that's there, that's like the thing, you know, there are two things I need in order to write something, or I've worked out it's just not worth doing. Like it's either won't be good or it won't get made. Which is like that resonance where I'm sort of like, oh, there's something darkly obsessive about this for me that I need to work out. Mm-hmm. And then a much more intellectual kind of like, why theatre? Like, why should this be on a stage? Why not any other medium? Because I just very strongly believe that for me, that's the only work that I want to make, because otherwise I think it's such a difficult art form to get right and to ask people to go and experience.
Yeah,
you know.
right.
So I kind of feel like when they see a play, they need to go, oh my God, I've never seen anything like that. Not, yeah, I saw a much better version of that on Netflix for pretty much free. That's not the experience I want people to have.
Huh. And so when you've let's say you've kind of, that you know you want to write about something and you feel like you've found, is it that you think you've found a sort of style or shape or form or register or tone or something? Is that the point where you feel like, yeah, actually now I am working on a play, I've got the sort of play idea in my head?
Yeah, I would never, there's never any crossover for me. There's never a moment where I go, oh, I wonder if this is a film or a play. Like the idea, this thing arrives in the form that it has to be in. There's never any me locating its form. They're one and the same thing. So yeah, I think for me, Very Expensive Poison was one of those things where I honestly thought I probably wouldn't do theatre again. I wouldn't do much theatre again before that. And then I started looking at that book, and I just had that very, very like slow dawning realization as I was reading it of, this is a show, this is a show, this is a play. Like, I know exactly what this should be. I felt there was a very quickly for me a formal meta-ness that I could apply to it, that was the only reason for me to do theatre at that point, because I think what I was becoming a little bit jaded about was my ability to tell stories in theatre that I thought were relevant or could compete, I suppose, with some of the experiences that I was having with more technological stuff. Like, I was very, excited by the ways of telling stories online, in games, in virtual reality, things like that. And so I was becoming a little bit like, yeah, maybe this isn't right. And then as soon as I thought, oh, I could tell the story, I could have the characters comment on the story from in front of the story on the stage, and then potentially even have another character comment on that from a box, which is what happens in Very Expensive Poison. Then I was like, okay, these sort of concentric circles, this commenting on something and then commenting on the comment, I then can get excited about it. I then go, that's how we live now. That's what it feels like to be alive now, to have events happen, and then to have, those events being commented on, and then to have that reaction being commented on and disagreed with, and to have those narratives be split and fractured. I sort of thought, okay, then this is what I want to do.
That's really interesting. I want to pick up some of that a bit later when we talk a bit more specifically about Very Expensive Poison. But how do you develop the idea? If you kind of know the sort of play you're trying to write, but do you walk around with a notebook? Do you do lots of research? Do you start writing immediately? How does that work?
No, I won't start writing it for quite a long time. No, I'm wary. I will circle the play, in a very suspicious fashion for a very long time. Like, I'm really like, it's terrible, but my feeling about writing is, it has to draw me in massively. Like, I'm so skeptical of any new idea. I'm really ruthless with myself, actually. Like, every idea I have, I'm testing pressure points for reasons not to do it. Like, reasons not to do it is my whole attitude, which is terrible. It's not something I'm proud of. But I'm a really big fan of the word no. Like, I'm very, very firm about not doing stuff that I don't feel passionate about. And it's because I've just had bad experiences of ending up I ended up saying yes to stuff and then having really bad experiences with it when I knew there was something in me that didn't feel it, that wasn't right for it. And so I've had such sort of like grueling experiences like that I never want to do it again. So what I do is I sidle up to an idea warily, and I kind of go like, okay, let's think about this. Is this real? Are you interested in this, or are you just sort of, is it a sort of playful thing that you'll pick up and put down? So I keep an eye in my mind on how obsessed I am with the thing. And sometimes, as with meeting somebody, like as with a lover or something, if you find you can't stop thinking about them, you begin to go, right, okay, something's going to have to happen here. Like this is going to have to resolve itself one way or another. And a bit like that with writing. So there'll be this long ramp up where I'm walking about, and suddenly I'll be talking to someone, or I'll hear a bit of news, and I'll go, yeah, that's exactly like this story. And then I'll go, oh shit, yeah, okay, you're mentioning the name of the play all the time. You're clearly like well into it. So once I've sort of convinced myself of my own level of interest, I will start researching it, and I'll do a lot of research, and a massive amount of that is just confidence building. So it's a trick, I suppose, that I'm playing with myself to convince myself that I am allowed to write the play. And because I'm generally interested in things that have quite extensive political subject matter or heavy information subject matter, I sort of feel like I need to earn the right to be in that world. So I'll do a lot of research, and that can mean talking to people, particularly something like The Effect, speaking to a lot of doctors, psychiatrists, people like that, and then also reading an awful lot. And then as I do that, I start to make notes, normally in 1 or 2 notebooks, sometimes more, where I'll just, everything that's really inspiring or interesting to me, I'll note down. And then eventually I tend to go through all of those notes later on and put the ones that are really important to me all into just 1 page or 1 notebook. So I have one thing left at the center of that hurricane that I'm like, okay, that's what you're most interested in, that's what the show is. But all of that is a sort of turbulent and time-wasting game to some extent. So I'm not saying I think that's an important part of writing. I don't. I think it's just a weird part of my personality.
And you mentioned that actually you've not written that many plays, so they come often quite far apart. Is that because that this weird playing hard to get with your own idea, stress testing process is just a very long? Does that happen over years and years?
Yes, absolutely, it happens over years and years. Yeah, and yeah, that's exactly right. It's something I used to torture myself over a little bit more, and now I'm prepared to look at it as a sort of quirk and something that in the end does work for me. I have occasionally toyed with the idea of going, why don't you just try and write something over a weekend? Like, why don't you see what would happen if you did that? And normally I just find it a little bit slight. Like, there's something in me taste-wise where I feel like, I remember reading an interview with Charlie Kaufman, who I admire massively and is a really amazing artist. And I remember him saying that, for better or worse, he wants everything he thinks to be in everything he makes at the time that he makes it. So if you watch something like, particularly something like Synecdoche, New York, that's a movie where you're like, well, this is ridiculous. It doesn't completely sort of make sense. It's unwieldy. Its form is very sort of fluid, and it's sort of a tiny bit clumsy. But to me, it's incredible for that, and that's what life is like. And I think, particularly with A Very Expensive Poison, I was trying to achieve something with that where I felt similarly, where it was like, I would rather that this was clumsy and unwieldy in its execution than it was clean and smooth and genreified, because I just think that that's not true of my experience of life. So yeah, that is why they sort of lumber on stage in a kind of incredibly like long process. But I also just feel like, for me, that's the ideas that I have. To go back to the lockdown and this sort of like pressure of productivity, I know when I feel like I have something worth seeing. You know, I feel like I have I stress test it so much within myself that I feel like there's an element of going, I only want to do the things that I'm obsessed with. And I don't think it's normal for a human being to have like dozens and dozens of obsessions. I think that's oxymoronic to some extent.
And so, I mean, imagine you've put this idea through this extraordinary process, and you've got to the point where you kind of think, actually, maybe I could write this. Do you plan? I mean, are you a big planner? Do you structure the whole thing out beforehand? What do you have to do to get to the point when you start writing, you know, scene one?
Word on a page, yeah.
Yeah.
It varies a little bit. The more I go into this, the more psychologically damaged I think I am. Like, there is a process where, you know, I will put the cards up on the board, you know, but that's more screen. Like, that's much more familiar to me as like television and film, to be honest. So I sometimes will do it with a play. I'll be like, the scene where they meet, the scene where I know I want there to be the explosion, whatever it, like really broad basic things will go up on, so I can see it on a board as a whole. But because I so often do that for screen, when it comes to writing plays, I will quite often deliberately not do that and start writing just the scenes, like as if I'm hiding from myself, where I should be putting it on the board, because the psychology there is like, shh, we're secretly going to write this play and not plan it, so that the super ego version of us doesn't know that we're not planning it. So this will be really mischievous and exciting, and then yeah, so then I'll be writing this play as if to thwart the other version of myself that wants to put cards on a board. So it's, I mean, I'm fucking mental, clearly.
So there's a voice in your head that's kind of going, you're not writing a play, are you?
Yeah, that's exactly
right. Wow.
That's exactly right. And that voice is also going, because if you were writing a play, Lucy, you'd be putting the cards on the board. That's what you'd be doing, wouldn't you? Not this. Not this weird, just opening a document and writing words for fake people to say.
So does that mean the first draft? I mean, does that mean the first draft is a slightly chaotic draft? I don't know. Or does it? Oh no, it is.
Totally. I would say my first drafts are extraordinarily chaotic and thin. So I and again, it's something that it took me a long time to realise, and I'm accepting it now. Like I'm Ben Power, who's a dramaturg and friend and writer. He often dramaturgs my stuff and talks about my stuff, and he's now really used to it. Like, normally a first draft will arrive and I'll send it to him just as a mate, really, and I'll go, this is obviously ridiculous sketch of what this could be, and it normally is. It's sort of like a very tentative impression of a play, and then there will normally be like one scene in it that is very bizarrely realised, like as in where you go, oh, okay, this is what you're actually writing the rest of this to get to at this moment. So there'll be a moment in it where that gives you a real clue to what the play is going to be or should be, and that's what that's what Ben will then go, that's, you know, we'll recognise and say, that's the heart of the thing, go back to that and start there, and I'll often do that. And yeah, again, it's this very self-fooling sort of arm's length approach, whereby I write a draft which is like, if I was going to write this play, you know, which I'm not, this is the sort of thing it would be like. And then to get myself to the next stage of going, right, okay, so now you look at that first draft and you go, well, obviously it's terrible and it's thin and it's as you say, sort of messy and chaotic, but what is interesting about it, what is good about it, what's the next layer of the lasagna, what's the next thing that you put onto this. So I'm a big drafter with plays. I'll go through dozens, actually, to be honest with you, sometimes 10 to 20 more drafts that feel like that game is being played over and over again, until there's something substantial that I've fooled myself into writing. And that is, and that's a very weird way of doing it. There's a lot of this, there's a lot of like a hurricane to get to the still center, I suppose, which is hopefully where it ends up.
My connection may be bad. I think you just said you do up to 20 drafts.
Sure.
Seriously?
Yeah.
And how different are these drafts?
Initially, they're very, very different. The first 5 or 6 drafts will be substantially different. Then they'll start being more similar, but with different structural and formal changes. And then sometimes quite late on, there'll be 3 or 4 very, very different ones. For example, with The Effect, I wrote a 3-hander and a 2-hander version of the play in order to prove to myself that it couldn't be, because I have a point with every play where it's sort of like, normally when they've programmed it already, but where it needs a lot of work.
Yeah.
Or sometimes just before that, where I lose faith completely in it. Like that's the complete shape of it. Like everything is great, and then boom, just complete, like, this is terrible. We can't do this. And that will take the form of several things. And one of the forms that it takes is me wildly reconceiving the play. So with The Effect, like I became convinced that it shouldn't be 2 doctors and 2. That really the story was the lovers. We should just do it like 1984, where you just focus on the lovers and you only hear voices. So I wrote that, and then I was like, it feels very sort of dystopian and actually a little bit disconnected. Let's have the one doctor, so let's have it be like the lovers and the authority figure, so it doesn't feel quite so sort of fakely dystopian. And I did that, and it was better, but it still felt like it lacked a table leg, like it was a table that you kept like going like this on. So then I just went back to the original 4-hander, rewrote it substantially, and that was quite late on in the process. And I did the same thing with The Very Expensive Poison, like about just after they'd programmed it, when me and John Crowley were talking about the play. I gave it to a couple of people to read, and they were like, it's quite sprawling and strange, and they said the same thing to me. They sort of said, it's really a thriller, isn't it? It's really a thriller. And of course, and at that stage, because I was at my point of sort of just completely lost confidence, I was like, yeah, it's really a thriller. It's really a thriller. And I went away and I rewrote it as a very, very clean, sort of quite driven thriller about a man solving his own murder. And it was focused on Sasha, and it was really, really propulsive and quite genre-y, actually. And I gave it to John, and I was like, is this the play with all the fat taken away from it, and therefore better? And John read it, and he just went, this is a better play, in a sense. Like it's a sort of, it's a kind of vehicle that drives on the road quite fast. But he said it's a better play, but it's a much less interesting one. Like, it's a much less interesting one. It's a kind of, what it's going to, it announces itself as what it is that, and then it ends. And I just remember, and so we talked at length about it, and I said, and he said, well, just remember why tell me again why you wanted to do this in the first place. Like, let's go back to the beginning when you read it. And I said, I suppose when I read about the story, when I knew about Alexander Litvinenko, I was so amazed by the ludicrousness of it. That's what it was. It was that I was reading this story and going, oh my God, it's so like life. Like, it's so ridiculous and nonsensical what happens to him, and the mistakes that get made, and the fuck ups, and the sort of the lies and the assumptions. It has all of these sticky out bits as a story. It has all of the things you recognize from life and that you cut from movies. And I thought, oh God, that's exactly the opposite of what I've just done. So I went back again, and I remade it with what I had loved about it in the first place, which was that it's this ridiculously sort of coincidental, bizarre, stupid spy story, really. Like they're idiots, the assassins that are sent over from Russia. As much as they are murderous, they are also genuinely idiotic as men. And I thought the more I sort of tried to make it fit into a genre that we recognize, the more dishonest it was, and it felt. And so but I had to go through that in order to get to where I knew I needed to go.
And if you don't mind me digging a little bit more into the full pathology of this.
Yeah, no, that's fine. Let's just go. Yeah, let's go full analysis.
When you say that there's this sort of crash moment where you completely lose confidence in it,
Every time.
have you actually lost confidence in it? What I mean by that is, having been through this process a few times, is there any bit of you that kind of goes, I have completely lost confidence in it, but I don't need to panic because I know this is a thing I do that will make it better? Or are you genuinely just going, it's shit, it's just absolute shit?
That's a great question. That's, yeah. For the very first time ever in my career, I did that with this play. So with A Very Expensive Poison, I felt that, I recognised it for the first time, and I chose not to embrace it. So when I say that I did all of that rewrite and everything, I did, like I enacted all of the things that I needed to enact, but I was much more self-aware as I was doing them, what I was doing. So as, you know, it's a thing that I wrote about in The Effect, which is that the doctor in The Effect has a line where she says something. Sorry, I only know this because we've just done a production of it that didn't go on, and I was there in rehearsals for some of it, and I remember being struck by it for the reasons you're saying. Is that the doctor says something about, they're talking about biases, and she says, yeah, you know, the tragedy. She says, like, even if you're aware of your own biases, you can't affect them. You know, you can't necessarily affect your biases, even when you're aware of them. It's one of life's tragedies. And I was very struck by that. So I still needed to do the same thing in the sort of the big rewrite and the panic. But for the first time, I was very consciously aware that it was a familiar feeling. And that I'd had that feeling before and it had been okay. And I think that's what's really important. So it's not that I didn't feel the feeling. I genuinely did feel like, oh my God, we can't put this on. I don't know what I'm doing. I had that feeling, but I recognized the feeling. I had the memory of it from before, and I trusted that my memory from before, which was that, and then it had been okay, could happen again. It might not, but it could happen again. It wasn't a certainty what I was experiencing at that time. Because I remember really clearly with the Effect of the play I wrote before that, I had this absolute breakdown of like, we can't put this on. And I would do this thing where if I read about anything even vaguely similar that was happening, and I don't do this anymore, but I had this obsession at the time, which was, oh my God, someone's doing something vaguely similar. We can't, like, I have to change the play. And that is a real pathology thing. I don't know what that's about, but it would be something I'd become obsessed with, which is this needn't exist now because someone else has done it better. And that would be a stage, and that happened as well. So yeah, it's weird.
And when you're writing these drafts, what's that writing process like? Is that a very sort of intense short period of time where you're kind of writing for long hours, so you're sort of pushing a draft out in a week, say, or are you nonetheless writing little bits over the course of a month or two, or what?
It varies massively over that period of time. With that many drafts, some of them will be, I'll take a month to reconceive and rewrite the play, particularly, for example, if you're thinking about from first draft to second draft, that for me is a big job. For second draft to third draft, it's normally a big job. I mean, one thing I always say to students when I teach, and I don't know if you find the same thing, Dan, is that people talk about let the first draft be shit, and that's absolutely right, you must. But in my experience, actually, the second draft is often the worst draft, which is terrible. You can't possibly think that when you're writing the first draft. But the first draft is usually inspired by a sense of kind of passion and mischief for me. And the second draft will often be in response to what some other people have said about that passion and mischief. And that can be very deadening and very confusing. Like you're trying to enact other people's thoughts on something that's very personal. And so it can be very tempting to give up after a second draft or to really question yourself. So I always kind of say to students, you don't know anything until the third draft. Like, you know, really, I think. And so for me, those are quite big, and I take quite big chunks of time to do them. But then after that, no, I mean, I'm also very, it's really not unusual for me to do a draft, genuinely a draft in a night or 2 nights, you know, like very late in the process, because I'm a big rewriter in previews, which, you know, is why actors hate me to some extent, because I'm very like, for me, there's 3 phases of writing. There's the writing of the play, there's the rewriting of the play during rehearsals, and then there's the rewriting of the play during previews, and they're all as important as acts, as stages to me. Because preview is the first time you get an audience in, and you learn just an avalanche of information with them as to what they feel and what they experience, and you see it again through new eyes, through eyes that you don't have access to really since you started writing your first draft, where you were in that position. And so I will do hefty work during those previews in terms of moving scenes around, deleting loads of stuff, cuts, but also if we need a scene that didn't exist, I'll write that scene. And it's hard for the, you know, technical people and the actors.
And when you're writing these drafts, this is a very nuts and bolts question. You're doing that, you're typing, you're not handwriting.
Yeah, I'm typing. I mean, I'll do a lot of handwriting as I sit there in an auditorium. Obviously, I'll be making notes, and sometimes those notes will take the form of dialogue when I sort of go, oh gosh, you know, we need someone to say that there, and that will be handwritten. But no, I'm pretty much all on computer now. Yeah, except when I do the earlier part of the process that we were talking about, where I take notes. If I'm interviewing somebody or I'm reading books, I'll always handwrite the notes. Always. I would never ever type or record and then type up. I'm not ready to get to the keyboard until I'm ready to write the play. So to me, the writing of the play is like me meeting the screen for the first time. Everything else is somewhere else.
And I've been asking a few people this question. Font. What font do you write plays in?
Oh, I don't know. Although it's interesting, I do know that I use a different font, and I deliberately do use a different font. I wonder if I should look. I think it might be Times New Roman on Word. Yeah, so for example, I write screen always on Final Draft as a system. And I very deliberately would never use Final Draft for a play, ever. Yeah, I do use Times New Roman, which I think is about the fact that when I was a kid, growing up, Times New Roman was very much the standard setting, I think, on Word, if I remember rightly. And I associate writing plays with a kind of childish mischief, you know. That's why I need it to be Microsoft Word. I need it to be a completely open space, a playground, I suppose, to go, Like, I'm going to choose where the stage directions go. I'm going to choose where the dialogue goes. Nothing's going to help me. There's no structure or format being imposed on me at all. Whereas when I write television, I go into final draft. I go into somewhere that goes, okay, now you do your internal, external. Now you do your set direction. Now you do your dialogue and your character. Like, again, going back to what we're talking about, I'm reactive essentially in that world.
Right.
Whereas when I write a play, I want to be completely and utterly in control of it and active and designing how it looks on a page, everything.
And I'm presuming that this I'm going to say method that you I don't know whether method is quite the right word.
Thickness, Dan, say it. We're all on board with it.
I presume that isn't what you can't do that with TV, with screen.
Which bit? All of the ridiculous amount of time and the over drafting and stuff.
Yes.
Well, I can a bit. Like, I do a bit of it. I certainly would never do that for something like Succession. Like, so I write on a TV show where it's show run by Jesse Armstrong, and then I will, I'll go away and I'll write the draft for the amount of time that I have, and I'll rewrite that draft, according to notes, and that's normal. And rewrite other scripts. There's something very freeing for me about that. Like, there's something very untortuous about that experience for me. So I'm free to sort of just, because I'm not the creator essentially, and yet in a way that allows me to actually create quite a lot for it. Like, I'm very, there's something about not having the very final say that means that I trust Jessie so completely that I just go, here, have all of this stuff, and then you choose what goes in it, and that's really relaxing in a weird way, compared to show running like I've just done with Susie, I Hate Susie, where, I rewrote that pilot, honestly, substantially 30 times, probably. Substantially 30 times. I think it could have been many of those other shows, and then it wasn't. And I was having to do the writing to find out what show it was, I suppose. And they all could have existed to some extent. So I did do it with that one. But then we, sold the pilot and got Sky to make it. So it was fine. But it's a terribly inefficient way to spend one's time, certainly.
Have you, because you've done, extraordinary show like Succession, which has been a kind of huge hit, and it's a very different way of working. It's a writer's room, I think. I think things like that, and other people I imagine you're contributing to the storyline in a sense, but somebody in a sense makes the final judgment about where you go. Has that taught you anything you think you might bring back to your theatre writing?
Yeah, it already has had an impact. So I was working on Succession, before I did A Very Expensive Poison, and it did have a real impact. It's a very supportive and very kind writer's room, the Succession writer's room. And I think I was very struck by how much a room depends on everybody saying stupid things, and that's partly for comedy. Comedy really thrives on you saying something that sounds ridiculous, and so feeling confident enough to do that is one thing. That's the cliche of the sort of American sitcom writers' room where everyone's topping each other. Mm. But then the other side of that is the safety to do that. So you have to have the confidence, but you also have to have the safety to go, I'm going to pitch something which is really stupid, and nobody's going to shame me for it. And so that, to be honest, that even that level of the people I would mention, people like Jesse, obviously Jesse Armstrong runs it, but he deliberately gets writers who are quite successful, like quite profiling. People like Tony Roche, Georgia Pritchett, John Brown. These people have had all their own shows. They've written, you know, they wrote Veep, they wrote The Thick of It, they wrote Avenue 5. They've written massive amounts of really, really big TV. So it's not people who are inexperienced and nervous about being there at all. But what they are is just lovely, lovely people. And I guess what I would just say is that it was more an emotional experience of being in a really, really supportive place with very, very funny, talented people. And I had experiences before, as I'm sure everyone has professionally, where I hadn't felt that, where I'd felt that there was a line drawn between people who were good and people who were kind to some extent. And I'd seen a bit of that in theatre. And it was through working on Succession that I realised that wasn't true, that actually there can be a massive overlap in that Venn diagram. And so I wanted to take that with me as an attitude, but also it meant that I felt safer. So I would go into, when we were working on Poison, and be like, you know, when we were in rehearsal with the actors, would say things like, listen, I haven't got this scene yet. I don't know what this scene is. I know what needs to happen in it, but it's not there yet. Can we read through it and talk about how it might go? Which I would never have done 10 years ago. Because I would have felt, and this is partly to do with it 10 years ago as well, when I walked into a space, I felt like I was walking into a space with a sense of having to prove myself. That whether it was television or theatre, that in a way that people's first responses to me were not going to be, oh, here is the writer. You know, the writer will tell us stuff. Like the people's responses to me were quite often confusion for being the assistant in a room. Quite often when I was starting in my 20s, I would often be having to let people know quite early on that I wasn't the director's assistant or the producer's assistant. And I think I developed a personality that was in relationship to that. And then once I worked in the Succession writers' room, I realised that I didn't have to walk into a space making sure that everyone knew I knew what I was doing, which was how I'd walked into spaces before, because I had been through a process where everyone didn't need me to prove that to them. They assumed that not only did I know what I was doing, but that if I didn't, they'd help me, so it didn't matter. And so when I started doing Rich Text Poison, I started realising that if you treat actors and designers and stage managers and people like they are resources who can help you, who can make the show better, who are artistically as creative as anybody else, and that you're not lessened by their input, or you're not lessened in their eyes by their input, you're actually going to make a much better piece of work. And so that's probably the biggest thing that I took out of it. But that's more of a personality thing, maybe.
Oh, I mean, I wondered. It's interesting thinking about the tone of that room, and you say that it's very kind and it's very supportive. And you mentioned that thing of comedy where you're trying out ideas, and somebody else would go, "That's a possible idea, but what about if we did it like this?" Of course, there is that, because Succession is clearly very, very funny. But there must also be a bit of that room which is about trying to undercut so somebody says something really nasty that could happen, and then somebody goes, that's kind of nasty, but this could be even more gross.
Yeah.
Is there a bit of that too?
Oh God, yeah. I mean, although it doesn't take the form that you've just outlined, it doesn't take the form of sort of topping nastiness. It's more like a real refrain of the room is Jessie laughing very hard, or all of us laughing, and then Jessie going, that is very funny, and by which I mean painful. And that's a real refrain of the room, which is like, if you're telling a story about your own life, as we frequently do, or you're pitching for a character, yeah, the more painful it is, the more physical reaction someone has to you telling the story, the more sign there is that you're on a really good, route. As you'll know, like if you're telling a story about something awful that happened to you, and I remember telling one about oh god, I was the first time I ever went to like a fancy party in LA. I was I was, for some stupid reason, I ended up going to like a party for the Emmys thing years ago, and I wasn't supposed to be there. I didn't want to be there, and I felt dreadfully uncomfortable, and my feet hurt, and it was not good. And I was going around the room, walking in circles, like, 'cause I didn't know anybody. I was like, why the fuck am I here? Going like, I'll just go to the toilet once more. I'll walk around the room and go to the toilet, and then I'll walk around and get a drink, and it was like, that's all I was doing. And then I saw this person who I recognised, and I was like, oh, thank God. And I smiled, and he smiled back at me really broadly, and I went, hey, and he went, hey. And I went, I think you're one of my agents. And I was like, I just got these American agents, and I'd only met them like twice, and there were sort of three of them because they sort of travel in packs. It's a very strange thing. And his face just dropped, and basically it was Jeremy Piven from the television show Entourage, who plays an agent. I know. He plays an agent in the show, and I think he thought I was joking. And in that very actory way, when I'd said hi to him, he had kind of just gone hi because he'd assumed I don't know, fucking work at Miramax or some shit at that point. And and as soon as I realised who it was, I died so hard. Like, I just almost, because my feet hurt anyway, and I was like, I'm going to collapse on the floor as to what just happened. So I obviously left immediately. And it wasn't like, but I remember I told that story, and everyone was laughing so hard at my ridiculous awfulness. And then I remember Jessica going, that is a brilliantly funny story, by which I mean horribly painful. And I just remember thinking, yeah, everything that is awful is material. Not to get too Nora Ephron about it. Everything that is awful is funny. Everything that is shameful is beautiful. Or will sort of make you, I don't know, make go towards your work. So it often takes the form of somebody going like, here's this terrible thing, and then someone else it won't feel like topping. They'll sort of go, they'll be your bills. It'd be like playing jazz. The best moments when you're writing with somebody, whether it's in a room or you're co-writing, will feel like jazz. Will feel like you say something, they say something, and it builds and it builds and it builds until you are sort of helplessly laughing, or one of you is crying.
And so this play, A Very Expensive Poison.
Thank you much.
Yeah, exactly. I feel like you can buy it here. No, so you've done a few adaptations, and this is sort of an adaptation in the sense that it's an adaptation of real events, and I think Luke Harding's book is the basis of it. Even so, you could have taken a lot of different routes through this factual material. What attracted you? Sort of answered this a little bit earlier, but what attracted you to the material first of all? Why did you think this is a story that should be on our stages now? And no, I'll ask those two questions, and I've got something else I want to ask after that.
Okay. I just had a very instant feeling that I was looking at a story of our time. I'm very attracted to stories that encapsulate something very global, but in a one event. And it happened with Enron, I suppose. I was very aware that something about when Enron happened in the early 2000s stayed with me quite a lot. I remember thinking about it a lot. I remember reading about it a lot. And then 10 years later, it was one of those obsessions I couldn't shake. So 10 years later, I was like, I feel like this thing happened that was really important, and then nothing changed. And it was very similar when I started looking at Very Expensive Poison, where I was already quite fascinated by the writing of Peter Pomerantsev. Do you know his work?
Yes.
Where he wrote, he's written a couple of things, and his most recent one, This Is Not Propaganda, I think is really good. But he was writing a lot about working in Russia in the 90s and early 2000s, where when basically everything became a moral free-for-all. So when the ideology of communism collapsed, and the system, to some extent, of communism collapsed, what you saw was the way that a society had been held together so purely by intellectualization and a sort of etiquette, a sort of formal religious, not religious, obviously, a religious etiquette. And really, when you just open it up, when that collapses, you're left with human beings behaving however human beings want to behave and saying whatever they want to say, and anything they say fundamentally being true or being real, you know. And so when I was reading about, I just sort of thought, when I read A Very Expensive Poison, I thought I had exactly the same feeling as I had with Enron, which was, this is something that happened, and nothing has changed since it. And so that can't be okay. There must be a build. And when I had that feeling, you know, before, it had some relationship to the financial crisis, I think, which was like, things cannot carry on like that without there being a consequence, you know, or there will be a consequence. And I felt very similarly when I read A Very Expensive Poison, which was, if we are prepared to have people murdered on British soil and for there to be no justice for that, then what else are we prepared to have happen? Yeah. And so that sort of just caught in the weeds of my mind as like something that had to, you know, flourish somehow. So it was that, really. And then, to be really brutally honest with you, I'd had to go through a lot with Enron to tell the story from many different sources. When you work on a real life story, you know, you have to be able to multiply source every single event that you use in that, in order for it not to feel like it's based on anything or any one person's work. So you have to do quite a heavy amount of journalistic lifting to get to the point where something on stage so that nobody can say, hang on, that's my thing, that's my book, that's my interview, that's my this. You have to multiply source, and that's actually quite a lot of work journalistically. And so what was very appealing to me also was being able to work with a Guardian journalist like Luke Harding, who's brilliant and who knows everything about that in and out, to be able to say, look, you know, anything I want to know, can you find it out for me, or can I ask you about it? Because I didn't want to go really through the months and months and months of sort of heavy journalistic interviewing and multiple sourcing that I did with Enron.
That's really interesting. That goes straight to the next question I wanted to ask you, which is, writing about real events and real people. I imagine it does, but maybe it doesn't. Does that sort of impose a certain kind of additional responsibility on you that shapes or constrains the writing in a way that, you know, I guess the Sugar Syndrome, these are people you sort of more or less made up, so it doesn't matter what you say they do. What role does a sense of obligation or responsibility towards the real people, what role does that play in the writing?
It absolutely does. It plays a huge defining role. I feel massive responsibility towards that, and I care about it massively. It's funny, you know, I would say that the work that I've done that has not been based on anything has probably caused more problems in terms of, you know, or more concern with people who I know who've been sort of plundered or referred to than anything. I mean, I feel a huge responsibility to anything that I take from real life, and I work really, really hard to take care of that, to do justice to it. So, for example, I work really closely with Marina Litvinenko from the very moment that we conceived it, not in order to portray her perspective on things necessarily, not because I felt I wanted to be a voice for her, even though ultimately I did, you know, like as in personally knowing what I knew I did. But that wasn't a political choice. What I felt was that there's a side of me that did always want to be a reporter. There's a side of me that is way more interested in real life than in fiction, and that is way more interested in the truth and the people than what goes on stage. So I worked very closely with her. I was very aware of how certain things would affect her. I felt like the right thing to do was to bring her through the process, hold her by the hand, bring her to rehearsals, talk her through the drafts. I mean, she was very interesting. She didn't want to read anything. She wanted to see it. She had a really good understanding of what the point of it was. So the point of the show, to some extent, was to bring a lot of people together to look at British institutions to some extent. You start with the NHS, you move through the police, you eventually enter the justice system and, you know, the legal courts of Britain. And I think Marina sort of felt like we wanted the cast and the theatre to feel like an extension of those processes that had been helpful to her in telling the story of what happened to her husband, rather than approaching her as somebody we needed to basically get the rights off or something, you know, which we didn't, but that's not the point. So I wanted to be her guide through it and her friend. And it was it was hard for her. There was a moment when we went to the first preview where, and press night as well, where she was very upset in the way that you would be upset if you watched your husband's death being reenacted. But she was upset in the way she knew what was happening. She'd seen it all before, but she was moved. And you know, I remember we took her backstage afterwards, but we had to go across the stage to do it. And it was this very, very surreal sort of Kaufman-esque moment of me with my arm around Marina, walking through all of the props and the scenery, which were all hung at the back of her life, essentially, in order to get back to the actors so we could all be together. And she's sort of walking through it all. And I did think, God, it's a serious undertaking to do that to someone's life. And you do have to take it very, very seriously. And that's why I'm not a person who does loads of projects at a time. I do one thing or two things at a time. And obviously that has financial implications, but I can't bear the idea of doing something casually. And so I feel massive responsibility to it, less so obviously with the characters in something like Enron. You know, I do feel responsibility to that, but I feel it in a very different way. I feel it to the employees of that company. I think when somebody's been actually convicted of a crime, as many of the characters in that play had, you then get a little bit of legal and moral dispensation to, you know, make judgments on their behaviour. But anyway, so the short answer is, I take it extremely seriously. And the one thing I would say that I'm genuinely pretty sanguine about reactions, but the one thing I would say that bothers me slightly about some of the criticism that came the way of A Very Expensive Poison was occasionally the journalistic assumption that, like, there was something frivolous or facetious about the telling of the story in that way, which was a very deliberate genre choice. I don't disagree that that's one way of looking at it. Like, I roll my eyes at my own work sometimes, but what I would say is that the people claiming, the times where people sort of claim to be offended on behalf of someone else, that they're naming, who I know I have worked incredibly hard to take really good care of, and not just take good care of, but to bring into a situation where they feel like their voice is being heard and their story is being told in a way that's incredibly important to them. And I spend a lot of time and energy doing that, and I would not do that work if I didn't. There's no way I would do that work if I didn't. I find that sometimes sort of offence by proxy by people who claim to care about someone else's feelings, but the reality is, do you care about their feelings, or do you want to have the opinion? Because if you actually care about their feelings, I'll absolutely show you how they feel. No problem doing that.
And I guess what you're talking about in the play that led some responses to think it was being frivolous is that it has a welter of different theatrical devices and styles. You know, there's the Kukli spitting image, sort of Russian spitting image puppets. There's the Putin being a character who sort of invades the play and so on. There's a shadow puppetry sort of history of plutonium. Is that right? There's the Berezovsky has a song, a moment. There's a nightmare scene. There's a bit where audience read out bits of the script. Obviously, this is all very deliberate. When I saw it, it felt like it was, you never quite knew where it was going to go next. Why was that for you the right way of telling that story?
I suppose that, like I said, when I first read it, I felt there was this echo in the story itself of what life is like now. So that thing that I think is particularly Russian about the late 90s and the early 2000s, that feeling of, oh my God, everything that we thought was safe is not safe, and everything that we thought was real is not real. And actually, one person doesn't have to behave like anything, you know, the leaders don't have to have any shame. Like, there was, that felt to me like it was entering our Western situation and governance very powerfully at the time. And that feeling of a sort of creeping authoritarianism is matched by my personal experience of feeling like I'm living in a complete sensory assault constantly. Now that's probably particular to me and people who live like me, which is I'm very online, as you know. I'm very sort of present on social media, stuff like that, which isn't necessarily great psychologically, but it produces a particular life experience, which I think a lot of people are experiencing, which is that the way that you interact with the news and the world is quite often in a very fractured way. Like, as in, so for example, with tweets or whatever, you will have, you know, heartwarming moment with puppy, Israeli bombing of Palestine and the bodies left over, someone being very witty about something that's happening in their life, someone flirting with somebody else that you don't know, and then a government announcement about something, and that those things are not in conflict, they're all in one space. So I think the thing that the internet, our experience of the internet, has in common with theatre is that you are location based. Space remains the same, so the screen remains the same, the stage remains the same. You're in a square, essentially, of space, but what happens within that space is not constrained by any sense of time, by any sense of logic, and certainly not by any sense of tone. So most importantly, the biggest shift I think that's happened in my experience of the world from 20 years ago is that, you know, the photos of the dying Palestinians who've been bombed and the puppy shot, and then the, you know, flirtation that someone's sending a picture of themselves to someone else, they're all in the same geographical space. They're not separated by time or by occasion. So that experience is quite mind changing. And it is something that only theatre can replicate, because film and television still run, for the most part, chronologically. They're still watching stuff over time happen. But theatre is actually about the geography. You have to go to the place of theatre, like you have to go to the screen to see what's on it. So it's actually different, and that's how they're similar. So I wanted to try and recreate that feeling of particularly tonal bashing against each other. So the vaudeville colliding with the investigatory thriller aspect of it, particularly. Also, with the character of Putin, the sort of the Muppets that he sort of is when he's leant over the box with the murderer, you know, and the horror where he actually grabs Marina by the neck at one point, and you know, you feel the visceral violence of that. So I think what's confusing and difficult about that, and it is difficult, you know, I find it difficult. What's difficult about that is you've got jokes or attempts at jokes genuinely crashing up against images of violence and also people talking about real things that have happened that are incredibly violent and upsetting. Like Putin's end of Act 1 speech, where he talks about the hostages taken in the theatre in Moscow and the deaths involved there, which really happened, whilst also very charmingly giving a little bit of stand-up to the audience and, you know, kind of winning them over on his side. And it's Reece Shearsmith as well, which is another level, you know, of sort of recognisable kind of where comedy meets horror. And that's kind of the point of the, you know, the whole point was to have comedy meet horror, I suppose, if there were any two genres that were crashing into each other. And that is simply because that is my experience of the world at the moment. And I'm not saying that's everybody's experience of the world, and I sort of hope it's not, you know, nor should it be, but it is my experience of the world. My experience of the world is every day that I wake up and I read what Trump said, or I hear what Trump said, I think it's absolutely hilarious, and I'm terrified. And those two things are my constant experience of the world. And so that's what I was trying to recreate. But I appreciate that that is troubling.
Thank you. Lucy, you've been amazingly generous with your time. That was fascinating. I wish you good mental health
Thank you.
for the rest of the lockdown. And I hope you, I hope you, whatever projects you're working on go well. I look forward to seeing you when it's all over.
Thanks, mate. And yeah, have a good one. And love to you and your family.
Cheers. Thank you very much. Bye.